CAP Center is a non-sectarian, non-partisan initiative of the University of California at Santa Barbara. We're committed to conversation, dialogue, as I said before. Some of our speakers, we all have ideologies and values, and some seem liberal, some seem conservative. Those are labels we try not to use in our planning for the CAP Center. If you think we're one or the other, just look at some of the people we have speaking this fall. And if you know anything about their public personas, you'll know that they're all over the place in terms of how people might categorize them. But we don't try to categorize people. Our next event will have Seymour Hersh, along with the Arts and Lectures program at the university, and that'll be an event at the university. And that should give you some idea of the contrast with previous speakers we've had. So I just say that to underscore the fact that as a public university, we try to engage conversation from many angles, and ideology is not a big consideration for us. We try to pick speakers that we think will provoke good conversation. Now, I do want to say that if any of you would like to be on our email serve list, many of you are, but if you aren't and would like to be, Brandy, who is out at the desk, would be happy to take your email address, and you will get a weekly message about CAP Center programs that will be coming up. And I encourage you to let us know if you'd like to be on that list. I also want to remind you that we are televised, Channel 21 here in Santa Barbara. Our programs are shown throughout much of California and occasionally outside of California in places that we're never quite sure where they will land up. The downside of all this is that sometimes they show up at odd times, like 3 in the morning. But for those of you who are insomniacs and watch your TV at 2, 3, and 4 in the morning, Channel 21, you might actually see some of these programs. In any event, again, I welcome you to tonight's program. Our speaker this evening is Jean Beth Elshtain, who is the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor of Social and Political Ethics at the University of Chicago. She's a prolific and influential writer. She's the author of many books, including Just War Against Terror, The Burden of American Power in a Violent World, Jane Addams and the Dream of American Democracy, Who Are We? Critical Reflections and Hopeful Possibilities, Augustine and the Limits of Politics, Democracy on Trial, Women in War, Power Trips and Other Journeys, Meditations on Modern Political Thought, Public Man, Private Woman, Women in Social and Political Thought. She is the editor of The Family and Political Thought, co-editor of Women, Militarism and War, co-author of But Was It Just? Reflections on the Morality of the Persian Gulf War, editor of Politics and the Human Body, editor of Just War Theory, and editor of the Jane Addams Reader. She is also the author of more than 500 articles and essays in scholarly journals and journals of civic opinion. She is a contributing editor for the New Republic. She has delivered several hundred guest lectures in universities in the United States and abroad, of which over 36 have been endowed lectureships. In 1996, Elshtain was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is the recipient of 7 honorary degrees. With E.J. Dionne, she is the co-chair of the Pew Forum on Religion and American Public Life. In 2003-04, she held the McGuire Chair in Ethics at the Library of Congress. She's been a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, a scholar in residence at Bellagio Conference and Study Center in Italy, a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow of the National Humanities Center. She also serves on the Scholars Council, the Library of Congress, and the Board of Trustees of the James Madison Program in American Constitutional Ideals at Princeton University. I could go on describing her many accomplishments and awards. Let me just say that we're extremely fortunate to have Jean Elshtain with us for this CAP Center event. Tonight she will speak on contemporary American politics, the ethical divide. Please join me in welcoming Jean Beth Elshtain.
Thank you very much. What Clark didn't tell you is that he and I were colleagues some years ago. I think it was in the 12th century or something like that at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Our paths crossed there for a number of years. I'm delighted that our paths are crossing here in this very different milieu and very different weather, I must say, than one got in Massachusetts a good bit of the time. As you heard in the introduction, I'm an academic, and that means that what can be said in one sentence, I'll probably take 5 to say. But I hope that I can nevertheless be as pithy as possible, and that the issues that I'm raising, at times it may be a little bit, there may be a bit of heavy slogging, but I think that you'll find points along the way where you can sort of enter into the discussion and into the conversation, and we can continue that for a period of time once I've completed my prepared remarks. I want to begin in an admittedly provocative way with some sentences from an opinion, an op-ed, the lead editorial in the leading journal of liberal Protestant opinion in the United States, a journal called The Christian Century. This is a journal that opposes capital punishment, opposed the war in Iraq, and so on, so its liberal bona fides are clearly in order. And this is what they had to say after the Democratic National Convention and listening to Ron Reagan's speech at that convention. Let me just give you a flavor of this editorial. How do you marginalize religion and trivialize moral argument? Ron Reagan, son of the former president, offered a textbook example in his speech in July to the Democratic National Convention, in which he called for more expansive research using embryonic stem cells. Reagan deftly made several familiar moves. First, he relegates strong moral beliefs to the private sphere. One is entitled to have such beliefs, but to argue for them in public is to force them on the many who don't share them. At the same time, he labels the moral claim that he disagrees with a theology, thereby eliminating the need to argue with it, and insinuating that those who press such a claim are guilty of religious coercion. He thus aligns his position with reason and progress, opponents, naturally, of theology. To see what is wrong with this argument, try substituting infanticide or slavery for stem cell research, as in, those who believe infanticide is wrong are entitled to their belief, but their theology should not forestall the well-being of the larger society or the movement of history toward enlightenment. Or, those calling for the abolition of slavery are no doubt sincere, but they shouldn't impose their private views on the rest of us. The logic of the argument is the same. Moral claims about the value of life cannot be relegated to the private sphere or dismissed as theology. Scientists' ability to create and to destroy embryos for research and therapeutic purposes presents a specific moral challenge for the valuing of human life. To deliberately create, use, and discard embryos for the sake of curing disease is to adopt, in an unprecedented way, a utilitarian view of life. Now, with some of these words sort of lingering in the air, let me turn to the burden of my argument, which is and will be a discussion of the entanglement of religion with American political life. That is an issue that comes up rather often in our political campaigns. It appears before us in political speeches and political debates, and it's one that I think we don't think about as clearly and as often as we should. Now, in this matter of the entanglement of religion with American political life, it seems to me that the salient question is not whether, but how. God talk, at least as much as rights talk, is the way that America has spoken historically and continues to speak. That is, we will never understand American politics if we believe that we can sever this politics from the interplay of America's religions, most importantly in our history, Protestant Christianity. As I'm sure you know, even though we are increasingly religiously diverse, America remains an overwhelmingly Christian nation in its religious identification. And in addition to the breakdown, for those who like statistics, of denominations and beliefs. Now, Clark can correct me if I'm wrong, because this data is a year or two old, but some 82% self-identified as Christian in the particular Pew study that I'm using here. The percentage of Americans who claim belief in God is over 90%. In fact, it's so high that when the New York Times first got this study, they didn't believe the data and wanted to run it again. I have a friend at the Times who told me about this. I think that it was a little hard for the New York Times to think that the figure could be that high, because after all, in Manhattan, it doesn't seem to be as high as all that. So what's happening in the rest of the country? Now, American democracy, from its inception, was premised on the enactment of projects that involved a complex intermingling of religious and political imperatives. The editorial in the Christian Century alluded to a couple of those, or at least to one of them in our history, and that is the issue of slavery, where the leading voices of abolitionism, as you know, came from the religious community. The majority of Americans historically, in our history, early history certainly, were religious seekers and believers who saw in communal liberty the freedom to be religious rather than freedom from religion. Now, there are some mistakes that often get made when we think about where religion sort of sits, if you're going to diagram political and social life. Where does it belong? The position the Christian Century was criticizing is a position that says religion is about your private beliefs and they best be kept that way. But that doesn't really mesh with our experience as a country. Although church and state are kept separate, as you know, ours has never been a theocracy, has never been a nation with an official civic religion. Religion and politics have always mutually constituted one another in ways both direct and indirect. In the American democracy, the action of religion on politics on religion, puts into play a number of important categories, including the believer and citizen, often the same person, as well as the church and the state, and religion and politics more generally. And the terrain in which they meet most of the time is this realm of institutional and associational life that we call civil society. Now, it's important to note here at the outset that one makes a rather major mistake if one maps the legalistic terms of the church-state debate, which are sort of narrow juridical concepts, if you map those onto the far more fluid and complex world of religion and politics. That is, church-state and religion-politics are not identical, that different logics animate each of these particular distinctions. That church and state are separate, in other words, does not mean that ours is a thoroughly secularized society. It isn't now, and it never has been. Now, in March 2000, the 96th American Assembly, which is a by now venerable institution, an effort that goes back over a half century, is designed to bring citizens together to confront honestly major issues of American public life, met to consider religion and American civic culture. Now, as one of the leaders of this assembly, it was my job to gain the widest possible representation of America's religions and to help steer our diverse group toward a statement we could all agree to and sign on with concerning the role of religion in American political life. And this group also included some very strong separationists, like Americans United for the Separation of Church and State and so on. So these weren't all people who represented a particular religious orientation. 57 men and women representing 16 different religious orientations, or legal orientations, one might say, attended. And I want to share with you 4 key sentences from the document that we produced at the culmination of this intense 3-day meeting. The organizers more or less locked us in a hotel and told us, we're not letting you out until you come up with a statement of some kind that everyone can agree to. So that meant some of us were up all night long working on the final statement, and we finally did get agreement, and it wasn't that watered down. Actually said something. And here are the sentences. We reject the notion that religion is exclusively a private matter, relegated to the homes and sacred meeting places of the faithful, primarily for 2 reasons. First, religious convictions of individuals cannot be severed from their daily lives. People of faith in business, law, medicine, education, and other sectors should not be required to divorce their faith from their professions, and this extends to people in politics as well. Second, many religious communities have a rich tradition of constructive social engagement, and our nation benefits from their work in such varied areas as social justice, civil rights, and ethics. Now, that's the end of the quoted material. Now, these conclusions suggest a logic for engagement in the civic realm that clashes with a dominant strand of argument in the academy and in some legal circles that doesn't really touch, it seems to me. This argument is often conducted at such an abstract level that it doesn't touch on how people actually talk and act and engage and react on the ground. And in an interesting way, young Reagan, I guess he's not that, well, most people seem young to me nowadays, but he was reflecting this particular position, which is a rather extreme one. It's associated with a very famous philosopher, very distinguished man, the late John Rawls. But the argument goes like this. The argument is that if you are religious, your convictions, if they derive from your religious belief, need to be translated, in a sense, into a neutral civic idiom if you are going to take part in political debate and deliberation. That is, it is illicit for you to bring forward to the discussion beliefs, arguments, claims that have an explicit and open connection to religious belief. You have to sort of bracket that and find another way to talk about these things. You'd best make this translation or remain silent. Now, the assumption here, clearly, is that there is a single vocabulary for political discussion. Now, this argument, I have to tell you, has made its way into a lot of jurisprudential thought and logic, a good bit of philosophy, and I think is reflected in some of the ways people talk when they don't like what they hear people with religious convictions saying. So at that point they say, wait a minute, that should be kept private. It's not licit. It's illicit, indeed, to bring this into a political debate. Now, this argument is part of a tradition that is, I'm going to use the word and then explain it, that is monistic. By that I mean there has to be one way of doing things, one strain of argument, one understanding of the way in which politics works, one understanding of the way in which authority is constituted, one language of public discussion, and so on. Now, I trace this demand to particular strands in liberal political philosophy. Let me hasten to assure you this doesn't have to do with contemporary debates between those called liberal and those called conservatives for the most part. Rather, it's a position that emerged historically and in very complicated ways from a strand, one strand of classical liberal political philosophy. It's an argument that cuts against the grain, as I've already indicated, of American political history and civic culture. For example, the United States Constitution, unlike the terms under which Jewish residents of the nation were admitted into civic membership in France, our Constitution had not required that the Jewish people give up the communal dimensions of their faith that found expression in and through Hebrew schools and communally enforced dietary rules and regulations and dress and the like. Indeed, to underscore the point about what Jews were to give up once they became members of the polity, Napoleon, who was aiming for the civic emancipation of the Jews, but under state terms, insisted that the meeting to discuss all of this with the Jewish elders be held on a Saturday so that they would have to violate their Sabbath in order to attend. Now, in the United States, what we see instead is complex ways in which what one might call confessional pluralism, lots of different religious beliefs, mostly within Christianity, but an explosion of denominations. That kind of pluralism and social pluralism really in many ways go hand in hand in our history, as religious differences did in fact have forms of public communal identification. And one reason that America's religious institutions remain at the heart of American civil society today lies in the fact that religion in America was never forced to privatize itself, as had been required in the radically laicist, as it's called, tradition in the French Republic. And it's an issue that still confronts them today, as I'm sure you know, in the debate over young Muslim schoolgirls and whether they are or are not, and the answer in France is are not permitted to wear the headscarf. Now, in the interest of time, I want to skip ahead a little bit, but I hope that the position that I'm arguing against is becoming clearer to you. That is, it's a position that insists not only do we have church-state separation, but we need to have a thoroughly secularized society in which religion is invisible to public life, because in this perspective, religion is by definition private and must remain so. So the notion of public religion is simply an oxymoron within this tradition. I think that would take care of the CAP Center, wouldn't it? If you didn't have anything called, you'd have to go out of business, because the work of the CAP Center, of course, is premised on the fact that religion historically in the United States has public ways of addressing the polity and of engaging it on a whole range of issues. Now, the notion is that when I speak as a citizen, I cannot explain my support for something or my dissent from a public policy measure in any language that incorporates any explicit religious reference or derives from a religious commitment. Now, what we see here with this, if you refract it from the point of view of religion, is a problem with narrowing the boundaries of politics. The problem looks rather differently. The problem from the strong separationist argument is that the danger is when religion starts to creep into political and public life. The danger from the point of view of religion is that politics suffers and constrains itself too severely if the boundaries are drawn in such a way that people cannot bring religious commitments to public and political debate. Now, let me say just a little bit more about the history of this strong separationist demand. It turns on the notion that both religion and politics involve total, comprehensive claims. They leave no stone unturned. If you have a set of total claims over here and a set of total claims over here, they're bound to clash. One has to be superior to the other, and that has to be the state. That's the way this tradition was created historically, and it derives in part from the terms under which religion was to be tolerated in the modern state. And this takes me to a very famous letter on toleration written by the famous philosopher John Locke, in which Locke drew up a map. If you could imagine again this sort of map of the social world, where you have soulcraft over here, and it's a sort of arena unto its own, and it's, carefully circumscribed. And then you've got statescraft over here, and that's a bigger realm and one that is, in fact, in many ways, one that the realm of soulcraft must be subordinate to. Now, Locke argued that a person could be a citizen of each. You could be in this circle over here and that circle over there, only so long as religion means primarily freedom of your own conscience. But the notion that you might have some strong institutional loyalty to your religious body, or that you might want to bring a set of religiously derived concerns over to statescraft, that's when Locke begins to get suspicious. And I think that becomes more intelligible when you realize that his letter on toleration said that we can extend toleration to all religions save Roman Catholicism. They can't be tolerated. Atheists can't be tolerated either, by the way. He argued atheists couldn't be tolerated because you can't trust them. They won't take an oath on the Bible, so there's no authoritative transcendental backup to the oath. So they can't be trusted. And Catholics couldn't fit within the terms of this particular understanding of tolerance because the view was that they had a dangerous double loyalty. They didn't fit into this singular monistic structure so easily. And that, of course, is a view that has been at the heart of much anti-Catholic prejudice and fear in our own country historically. Those of you in the audience of a certain age, as am I, will remember the way in which this fear was expressed at the time of the 1960 presidential election and the campaign of John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy really had to do a sort of command performance before the Houston Baptist ministers to assure them that in case of a conflict between his faith and his duties as president, that of course his faith would be subservient to his duties as president. And he was compelled to do this for the obvious reasons, because of the historic worry that somehow Catholics didn't have the kind of loyalty to the state that was demanded and required. We don't require of Catholics that they do that anymore, for the most part, but I think there's still a lingering suspicion about anyone whose religious belief isn't just about my own freedom of conscience, but is rather about the kind of person I am in every aspect of life, including my public presence and witness to the wider world. So private freedom of conscience, yes, and that was considered infinitely superior to any other way of being religious. Now, one of the country's leading constitutional scholars on the free exercise of religion, his name is Michael McConnell, and this is what he has to say about these terms of toleration. Locke's exclusion of atheists and Catholics from toleration cannot be dismissed as a quaint exception to his beneficent liberalism. It follows logically from the ground on which his argument for toleration rested. If religious freedom meant nothing more than religion should be free so long as it is irrelevant to the state, it does not mean very much. That's the end of the quote from McConnell. Yet this, he goes on to say, is precisely what this regime of toleration pushes towards and what it requires. Under those terms, I'm calling monism, liberal monism. Now, let's look at some of the religious responses to this demand, because there's not just one. There are lots of ways that people with religious beliefs and commitments have responded to this insistence that if it's about religious belief, keep it to yourself, keep it private. I'm going to go over 4 positions here, and I don't think you'll have too much difficulty telling which one I prefer. But I'll tell you in advance, it's number 4. So, and we'll get there soon enough. The first position, and I came up with names for all of these, tags for all of these. I'm not sure they're the most felicitous, but too late now. The first position holds that the fullness of religious belief and commitment and witness must enter the public sphere precisely on the terms of religion every time someone with religious beliefs goes public, so to speak. This doesn't have anything to do with the legal establishment of religion. It has to do with the conviction that religion is undermined if persons with religious commitments go through any process whereby they try to make those commitments intelligible to citizens who don't share their commitments. In other words, it's what I call here full-bore Christian politics. It also assumes that there is a religious position, or a Christian position in this case, because my example comes from Christianity, one expression of Christianity. It assumes that there's a Christian position or a religious position on every issue, as if every issue somehow that comes up for public policy adjudication calls upon me for a religious response. So it assumes that a full display of religious reason giving is appropriate and may even be necessary, including scriptural proof texting and so on. The second position may look similar to the first, but it isn't. It's quite distinct. It's the prophetic witness position. Now, within this frame, no one is pushing for some thorough sacralization of every aspect of political life. Rather, what this position involves is that religious persons respond to extraordinary situations from the fullness of their religious commitment. And the greatest example of this in our own recent history is, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. All of King's great speeches were sermons. Stephen Carter has written about this quite wonderfully in recent years. It would be an act of the most severe restraint on public speech if one were to require of Dr. King retroactively that he drop all religious references to Scripture in his speech. He couldn't have made a single speech. One of his greatest speeches, arguably his greatest, of course, is the I Have a Dream speech, which is simply unintelligible unless you have some familiarity with the sort of rolling cadences, of course, of Scripture, but also the basic text for King is drawn from the prophet Amos, "May justice roll down like a mighty river," and so on. Now, whether full-bore Christian politics or prophetic witness, these first two positions, the requirement from the direction of the strong separationists would be that both those positions are unacceptable. Both are suspect as public discourse because, the argument is, they are mounting claims. Their claims are based on what Ron Reagan called theology, and therefore ought to be kept out of political debate. They're based on private revelation and therefore should be kept out of political debate. This is a misunderstanding of religious argument. The view is that somehow if it derives from religious faith or from theology, that there's no possible way to challenge it. All you have to do is be a member of a congregation to know that isn't true, because Christians and my husband, who's Jewish, tells me that this happens in synagogues too, argue with one another all the time about how particular passages are to be interpreted and how religious commitments should enter the political arena and in favor of what policies or opposed to what policies. Each of these is a contested interpretation. So the notion that it stops the argument is simply palpably empirically false. All right, two more positions. A third response on the part of persons with religious commitments to the demand that I've talked about now at some length goes like this. It says, in effect, well, if that's the way they want it, we're just going to retreat into our own enclave and live out faithful lives as Christians in a community of faith. The wider world is going to hell. There's not very much we can do about it. So what we best do is to simply, as Voltaire's Candide, tend to our own garden, be faithful within our own communities of faith. Now, this particular position, I call it a radically dualist position because of the sharp divide between the church and the world. And you can see in this a kind of religious version of the strong separationist position, in a way. This particular position argues that, or those who advocate it argue that citizenship itself and loyalty to your polity is potentially idolatrous because it invites faithfulness to something other than church. So in a way, it's a kind of negative mirror image of the full-bore Christian politics, in a sense, but also sort of mirrors from the religious side the separationist position. One example of this radical dualism in practice is an argument that I read, an article not too long ago by a Christian religious thinker who argued that the Catholic understanding of marriage is the quaint property of a few believers. The notion that relationship, the marriage between a man and a woman is a sacramental union, a monogamous union for life. And that there's no point in lifting up this notion of marriage in public debates because the civic world is going to construe marriage as a narrow contractual relationship that you can break whenever you want. So why even bother to bring this understanding of marriage to public discussions? So if the public wants to have reinstate or exhume polygyny and polygamy and so on, fine, go ahead and do it. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is that we be faithful to our own understanding. Now to the fourth option. It's my preferred alternative. It calls upon citizens who are also religious believers to offer an assessment of the ways in which religious belief enters civic discourse, to think about what they're bringing to the public and civic discussion. I think that what one brings to it is going to depend clearly upon the nature of one's religious faith, upon that particular faith tradition and the history of its engagements with political life. It's going to depend on what the stakes are in a given issue. Stakes often in democratic politics, are not huge often. It's about details of a budget agreement or nuts and bolts in some other way. It doesn't really call up it doesn't have the gravamen of some of the really major moral questions that we have confronted in the past and continue to confront. So you say, well, what are the stakes here? What's involved? Who's affected? Is this a common good question? Is everyone in the society implicated in this? Does this have to do with who is in or outside the boundary of moral concern? Are we widening the boundary of moral concern or narrowing it? And so on. So all of this lends itself to a position I call contextual engagement. You can't just step forward and say, I believe the following, and take it or leave it. That's maybe a way to start a discussion, but you have to keep the discussion going. Most of the time, again, and we should be thankful for that, the lines are not drawn in the sand. Most of the time, religious believers with other citizens can come to mutual agreement and compromise on a whole range of issues without someone's faith being trampled on in a major way, or without someone's moral sensibilities being deeply, deeply offended. There are enough issues, Lord knows, of that sort. We shouldn't go searching for them. Not every issue is like that. Most of the time, in American political life, most of the issues are not like that. There are some that are. Issues that we face now, have faced in the past, ongoingly face. Euthanasia, the abortion debate, cloning and the stem cell debate, because cloning is the way you get stem cells, as you know, capital punishment, and so on. War-peace questions, often these require going all the way down in your argument and bringing the full panoply of your reasons to bear, including your understanding of the human person and the dignity of the human person, your understanding of human rights. Do we have human rights just because we all sort of agree that it's more or less a good thing? Or do human rights mark a human dignity that is not given to us by the state, cannot be taken away by the state, but comes instead from, as the American founders suggested, nature and nature's God, or the hand of God? These are very, very deep, complex, and vital questions, and they're questions that we have to find some civil way of talking about. Now, most of the time, as I've already suggested, Total claims are not at stake in these matters from the religious side, but it's an attempt to promote or to defend a religiously derived understanding of what social justice in this instance requires, or that we would arguably have a fairer society if we did the following. And one appeals to one's fellow citizens as citizens, and knowing that you, as a believer, are a citizen that brings those beliefs to bear, but you have a way to bring those beliefs into the public discussion without recurring to any religious credo most of the time. Now, what this involves is to turn the usual way of framing the question around. The usual way of framing the question is, how can or should politics accommodate religion? Politics always represented as the dominant category, and then politics determines, do we accommodate or do we not accommodate? Another question, what is acceptable and non-acceptable from the political side, where the public presence and voice of religion is concerned? Should we permit religious persons to play a robust public role? Now, a theologian, a very good one, named Robin Lovin, has argued recently that there's a very abstract quality to this way of putting it, that instead of looking at how things actually play themselves out on the ground, we move way up to this abstract plane and say, well, ought this to happen, or should this happen, or what are the precise logical terms under which the following should go forward? Lovin says, how about if we frame it this way for a change? From the point of view of religion, what sort of politics does religion require in order to play a role that religious commitments may demand? A role as a citizen of one society, as an active, responsible citizen of one society. He says perhaps the problem in many of our discussions has been narrowing our understanding of politics. That often it's cast as the dangers of intrusive religion. But isn't there a danger if we narrow politics unacceptedly? It would be nice to have Dr. King here responding to that one. He asks us to look at how people actually talk when they go public. He said, if you do that, you're going to find that our political discussions are as various as the participants in them. All manner of identities and commitments and concerns are brought forward on issues of unusual gravity. Nearly everyone, without exception, speaks of a public good or of the common weal, religious and non-religious persons alike. Everyone who goes public embraces a set of practical concerns, unless at a given point in time one's purpose is prophetic witness to a sin of great magnitude in a moment in a country's history when calling attention to something seems more important than any particular incremental change. But most of the time we say, how can I best advance my cause? How can I best make my case? Who can I persuade and how? What am I prepared to compromise on? What is rock bottom for me, and I'm not going to be budged? I submit to you that religious and non-religious citizens alike do this, and that within a framework that one associates with some of the great exemplars of public religion in our country historically, like the late Reinhold Niebuhr, what's involved is looking at the interaction of religion and politics as a continuing tension in which religious judgments are always in danger of being dismissed and ridiculed, the way Ron Reagan did, at times even persecuted, but in which religion nevertheless provides the critical, these are words from Lovin now, self-limitation that keeps a political system from overreaching itself, from sort of running roughshod over all the independent sectors of civil society. Now, a desire to be politically effective means that one rarely offers religious reasons as the exclusive reasons for one's stance. If you go through and go over the ways in which religious bodies, through their primary documents and entreaties, enter the public arena, you're going to find them addressing themselves to all citizens without distinction. not just to their co-religionists. Certainly, Roman Catholics are very well equipped to do this, given their venerable tradition of natural law and common good arguments that, again, are made to all persons without distinction, not exclusively to members of those who are in communion with Catholic Christianity. Now, the upshot is that the demand that religious persons clean up their act is largely unnecessary, because most persons religious offer a variety of reasons for why they favor or oppose something. Most of the time, these reasons are not exclusively religious, but in addition, the demand is unfair, because it places a burden on about 90% of the American population to strip themselves of their religious convictions in the course of participating in some rarefied notion of public reason. Now, if in fact one of the functions of those with strong moral and religious convictions is to be alert to moments when you think politics may be in danger of overreaching itself, or when you think that there's a certain critical perspective that can be brought to bear on public speech, those sorts of moments are vitally important in order to have a vital democracy. And I want to give you one other example drawn from this political season. It's another example drawn from the Democratic Convention, which I saw more of than the Republican Convention because of my travel schedule. So I don't mean to be picking on the Democrats, but here is, this struck me, and I thought, this is where we need some critical distance and critical challenge. People are prepared all the time to challenge folks who come forward with a claim or an argument or a commitment based on religion. But what about this? Do we challenge the following as frequently as we ought? I'm thinking of, and I think it was just a throwaway sentence perhaps in his speech and wasn't particularly well thought out, but I'm thinking of Senator Kerry's speech in which he said, "The American people need a president who believes in science." And I started to think about that and thought, what does it mean to believe in science? We certainly don't want science to be in a special category beyond challenge. If we do think it's in a category beyond challenge, that science is per se good, certainly defies history, when we know good and well that science has been turned to all sorts of less than benevolent purposes. It also means that the arguments of a person with religious convictions who mounts a scientifically informed argument challenging a particular scientific procedure, that argument is discounted because it's labeled theological and not scientific, and therefore can be ignored. Too often, and I'm not singling out any particular person here, it's just a general observation, when people present their arguments from the point of view of an enterprise like science, which has such tremendous authority in our society and power, they assume that they don't have to make an argument, that if we believe in science, that's enough. We don't have to say much more. One has to instead, I think, acknowledge how highly speculative many of the claims of science are, especially in the area of genetics and genetic engineering. Speculative and I would say dangerous. I think it's too late in the day for any of us, for responsible public figures, to push a discredited distinction between faith and science by calling for an uncritical belief in science. I have been talking about how we should not have an uncritical belief in belief, that we have to think about and challenge the ways in which believers bring their beliefs to the public square. Same holds for people who believe in science. The matters involved are far too complex for that. And honoring that complexity means one has to abandon utopian rhetoric and abandon the automatic assumption that the authority of a practice like science, which again enjoys such prestige and has such power in our society, automatically trumps any other kind of argument. I think I was perhaps thinking about this especially as I thought about tonight, my flight in yesterday from the Midwest. I was reading a book about the best science of the day that led to the horrors of eugenics, not just in Nazi Germany, but eugenics in the United States, based on the best science, the enormous confidence from the top scientists, not crackpots, top scientists, that you could confidently get rid of bad genes and characteristics and breed in only the good ones. That you needed eugenically derived alternatives in order to get rid of those who had these bad genes and who had these qualities that you didn't want to pass down from generation to generation. We know what that led to in mid-20th century Germany. I think most of us don't know what it led to here, which was a whole series of statutes in many states that led to the coercive, involuntary sterilization of persons. That was one of the charges brought against some of the defendants in Nuremberg. It was a practice that we engaged in here, and it was all with the imprimatur of science. So science, as with any other human endeavor, needs to be subjected to critique, can't simply be believed, has to be evaluated from the side of moral and religious and political argument, has to be debated by ordinary citizens. We cannot place a special burden on some to justify their way they're arguing and give others a free pass. Everything has to be looked at, I think, quite carefully, science not accepted. So, what one needs to bring in cases where someone says, we just need to believe in science, is an evaluation of that kind of claim. Historic reasons for why perhaps that claim can be worrying. Ask for more detail. When does the belief stop? Is the belief to be uncritical? So, let me conclude. The realm of political life, I want to insist, is political. It isn't religious. You enter political life as a citizen, but you may be a citizen with religious convictions. So these convictions go along with you as you stride into the public arena. You take all sorts of things with you when you enter civic debate, whether you're black or white, male or female, able-bodied or with a disability, whether you're from Mississippi or Minnesota, and so on. You bring all these particularities with you. That's one of the great things about the American democracy. These particular facts about us help to determine who we are and how we think and what we care about and how we argue. And that is as it should be in a democracy. So the implications of my argument for civic life is that it makes no sense to single out one group to view strongly held religious convictions as a particular threat rather than as an intrinsic part of American pluralism in all its messiness. People reach for the principles that animate not only their lives, but the wider lives of their society, reach for those from a variety of different places. Practice them in a variety of different ways, so long as these ways are consistent with the overarching commitments of the Constitution and of some very, very fundamental commitments to basic human rights. So, it seems to me, instead of all doing what is done often and saying, well, people shouldn't be talking like that, that what we should do instead is just listen once in a while. And if you listen once in a while, what you're going to hear is endless varieties of civic speech, different intonations and accents and harmonies, atonalities, punctuations, pauses of American speech. It's extraordinary, really, the vast sort of panoply of possibilities. Civic life is one way that we move out of our little universe of one or a few into this wider world in which there are multiple idioms, including their religious variety. And we can come to have profound disagreements with some, perhaps to appreciate some others, but understanding that these are ways of living complex human lives. And even as we acknowledge all of this, At the same time, it seems to me, we are obliged as citizens, whether we are religious believers or not, to try to articulate some notion of a good that we can come to know in common, that we can't know alone. So, how do we talk? I would say just listen, and I think if you listen, you will find that we do not have to take special steps in order to carefully circumscribe the boundaries of civic speech. That in fact, the more voices that we bring to the debates, the better, and that no one should have a special burden to remain private with their most profound beliefs, but instead to bring them forward and to see if they can make a difference in civic debate and contribute overall to the common good of the American polity. Thank you very much.